Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Friction Log. Today I have a guest with me that it is actually somewhere around here. It's live. We don't have Rick today, but we have Kincy. Kincy works with Rick on OneStudy, which we have mentioned in previous episodes a little bit of what they do. But I really wanted to have him and to explain what does he do, explain us kind of like a one sentence or two on OneStudy, and then get to talk about product building today. So Kincy, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I've
All
heard
right.
a lot about Friction Log. I'm finally a guest.
Welcome. So why don't we start with what have you been up to? Who are you? What do you do? What do you like to do? Things like that.
Yeah, well, what I've been up to is building OneStudy with Rick. That's taken, I'd say, all of my time. Started that out. I started that journey, August of last year, maybe September. And then Rick joined up in, I want to say, late December, January. Anyway, so most of my time has been spent really focusing on customer discovery and really trying to understand the problem that we're attempting to solve.
Okay. And can you put OneStudy in one sentence? Like, what are you trying to solve right now? I know you're doing product discovery, but try to describe what is OneStudy.
Yeah, that I think is the hardest part of a startup, is coming with that one word description of what your company does. So I've made tons of really bad attempts at this. So basically, we allow companies to conduct qualitative research at scale. And then I'll add on using conversational AI. But really, our goal, our mission, what we do is qualitative research at scale.
Okay, so in order for you to do that, you also have to do your own research about your product market fit and stuff like that. So it's almost like by building it, you're almost kind of like ingesting that same knowledge and applying it to your own product, which seems very interesting. And I assume that involves talking to a bunch of people. Can you talk a little bit about how many people have you talked to? Kind of like the kind of profile that you're looking to understand those kind of things.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey. We started out with the idea of the origin story is really Rick's to tell, but I took kind of the direction of qualitative research into a B2B product category. So B2B was that's my people, B2B enterprise. That's what I've done my whole career. So I went and talked to a lot of product managers that were in that space. And candidly, there just wasn't a ton of oh my God, this is amazing. I would characterize the interest as warm. And it took us a while to figure out. The problem was that these people didn't have a scale problem. So when we started talking to product managers, maybe building apps, maybe in mobile, maybe building more subscriber driven type things, really B2C, then we started seeing a lot more interest and eyebrows going up okay, this is a potential game changer. So really, I pivoted in the discovery and started talking to app developers, product managers in that space, growth marketers, growth product managers, anyone really who had growth, retention, and some connection to the product. That's who I was talking to. The one detour we took was we really explored a ton of other options like communities. So we looked at veterans. We looked at education as possible use cases, because at the end of the day, anyone who talks to a lot of people is a possible customer of ours, but we've really narrowed in on kind of this business to consumer direction.
So you're a business to business company that your customers are business to consumers.
Yeah, so
right?
B2B to C is the buzzword these days.
Okay. And when you're talking with all these people, you narrow down your market, what kind of notes do you take? Do you just ask them, do you have a problem with user retention, or where do you start there?
Yeah, I'll be honest here. I started out a little from the hip. So I have some formal training in kind of doing this kind of research from military, from an information collection, which is different than intelligence, but from an information collection. And we tend not to use scripts in those scenarios. We tend to think about requirements, what you want to learn. But it took me a while to learn, but I really needed to come to the party with a little bit more structure. And so over time, I'd say over the past couple months, I've really built out a series of questions that I can easily deviate from, because people will say things and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to learn more about that. But I really start out with a structured script that I can use as kind of a starting point. And it also just, I don't have to think when I'm starting the interview, because that's the hardest part. You've built rapport, you've asked them where they're from, and now you want to kind of jump in. And if you have to remember that question every single time, it puts kind of a in the conversation. Whereas if you're just like, okay, let's get started. My first question is X. And that first question changes. I'm always changing my script. Like every conversation, I'm always making little notes.
Yeah, with every feedback that you get, every experience, then you start to add some of that into that.
Exactly.
It's very common that I see building products, building solutions within the products, very, I want to say like leading questions, or very like, would you like to do this or that? Don't you have this? Which the answer sometimes it's yes. But you kind of like are leading towards that, and that's pretty common. How do you manage to stay away from that?
By having a script. And, I went to the Steve Blank, he did 4 Steps of the Epiphany, pretty well-known startup guy, really started the lean startup revolution. And he's got some great videos on not doing leading questions. I will say again, some of the training I've had in the past on conducting interviews and information collection, I'm really good at not leading people and not coming in with kind of a priori assumptions. I'd say I'm better than most at that. So I don't fall into that trap. But again, having a script and then just really letting the conversation goes where it goes and don't try to drive it.
I also, and this is something that I'm culprit of, awkward silence, right? You ask a question and then there's silence because the other person is thinking about something, and sometimes they're thinking about the actual answer, or sometimes they think about like, what does he want me to say, right? Yes. Like that kind of thing. I guess that you're very good at silence. Like you don't care. You're like
super cool with silence.
Okay, that's not me.
Yeah, and I've been in a few where the other people that maybe were interviewing were uncomfortable with the silence. But again, like you got to let people kind of like think about it a little bit and really try to get them to ask stories, to pull those stories out. And stories don't come to people automatically. Like if they've never been asked this before, they got to think about it. So yeah, being comfortable with silence for pauses and breaks and not trying to fill it, super important.
Okay, that makes sense. So a lot of your conversation, or let me roll back for a second. Your whole company is about qualitative studies, right? Do you use any metrics in these interviews, or do you go to the qualitative side in your decision making, or how you're taking this product? Like, how much do you balance those two? Because that's really what I want to talk today. I come from a background of building products too. I happen to work in a company right now that it is a data company, right? It's a ton of data. We try to make sense of it. We try to make decisions out of that data. There is some qualitative analysis, but at the end of the day, it's a company that just has terabytes of data. So to me, what you're doing is totally the opposite. I don't think either can be 100% true all the time, but how do you deal with that qualitative? Like, do you do any metrics at all?
At this point, we don't really have any usage metrics. We do probably do some quantitative analysis around like, hey, 5 people said this, 2 people said this. Like the quantitative data that we use is not statistically significant, but we're also kind of solving a different kind of problem. We're trying to understand like what we're going to build. And I think when you're doing some blue sky stuff, like getting really wrapped around the numbers can be dangerous because we don't have users, right? So we don't really know what the behaviors are. So I say like we do some very basic quantitative analysis. Now I will say there is a difference between 0 and 1, and there have been multiple features, usually me getting excited about them. And, Rick will generally be like, hey man, like who's asked for these? I'm like, dude, this is just a great feature. He's like, why don't we just wait? Like we got a lot of things to do. So he definitely kind of calms me down. And I think, again, that's a quantitative measure. We have 0 feedback for that feature. So I think that's important. So definitely using that, and we're building some things in there to capture usage and things like that. But by and large, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of the quant approach to product building. I think there's a place for it, obviously, but I think the whole data driven
decision making.
It drives me crazy.
It's and there is a lot of companies, and every time like you build a website or you build a product, and the first thing that you probably don't do Google Analytics anymore, right? You do Mixpanel or something like that, but it's like, oh, I got to put some analytics in my site to try to understand. But that, like, even people that are just starting, I don't know, blogging, right? Like, they want to know numbers, and there is a little bit of dopamine, I guess, that you get, absolutely. Even on a personal level, on a company level, you can share that. Like, data is just there, and I happen to work with a lot of it. But why do you think that people don't focus that much on qualitative data?
I think there's two reasons. I think the first, which is a very valid reason, it's expensive and it's time consuming, and it's hard to talk to customers, especially when you have millions of them. So it's hard to set times up with them, especially if certain types of consumer apps, like they're just not interested in coming in on Zoom. They're not interested in, engaging you. And so there's a lot of energy that you can really spend there chasing them down. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's hard. I do think though that a lot of people really get over consumed with statistical significance. And I've heard in multiple conversations, I don't like qualitative data because if you only get 10 or 12, answers, is that better than, behavioral data? And I would argue sometimes it is. So I think there's a bias that somehow qualitative data is less important. And again, I think it just matters what you're applying it to. I think the application of the data and how you use it is really important to understand that. A great example is you can get behavioral data and understand why people aren't clicking on a button, or maybe it's just cheaper to go ask 5 of your customers why they're not clicking on the button rather than guessing and doing A/B testing and all this other stuff. Why don't you just ask? Because if 5 people tell you the same thing, that's probably the answer.
Yeah, I totally get it. I think also there is this notion that because technology scales easily, right? You don't need more people to get more clients. You're always going to capture the biggest audience that you can. Yeah. And data is going to give you that answer simpler than going and talk to them. But I also, my background, there is also a part of me where my dad had a small business and his business was making personal relationships with one-offs, right? Yeah. Customers that were, so I also saw that growing up, customers that were asking for this one thing that nobody else was wanting for, but there are some of the most loyal customers that throughout the years, right? And then moving into the tech side of the house, you always are wary about having one of those big customers, because if they go in a year, then you're done, right? Exactly. So it's always that balance, that back and forth. But what has changed? Is this because we have new technology available to do some of this? Is this because you're seeing some signals? What are you why you guys start doing this right now? Because I don't think there's anything new in it.
No, there's not. I mean, well, what's new is generative AI, and we'll come back to that. But I think both of us have a passion for listening to people and hearing what they're telling you. And again, they'll tell you why. Again, you can have a lot of behavior data that people aren't clicking a button, but none of that data tells you why they're not clicking the button. And to get to why, you have to ask. The other ways you can guess, right? You can guess. You can say, well, they're not clicking this button because it's red, so we're going to change it. We're going to do an A/B test, and we'll do green and purple buttons, and then we'll oh look, 52% of them are purple, and they click that. It's because it wasn't a green. Why don't we just ask them why? Because maybe they don't like the words on there, or maybe they're not interested in what's behind the button. So you kind of lose that sort of information. And I think we both come from a place where I would just rather know why. I would just rather ask people and find out why rather than guess with stacks and stacks of data. And I think I've just been the victim of a lot of bad data practices in my professional career because I come from a support background. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to misunderstand signals from support because they often don't want to accept that qualitative feedback. They don't want to hear what your customers are telling you. So I do think there's a huge drive to try to use that qualitative data right now. But there is this weird wall around a lot of product managers that I just think a lot of product managers get too many inputs and they don't know how to like manage all that data. And it's just easier to, and I definitely heard this, especially with the B2B guys. One of the quotes I really loved, and I've used this a lot since then, is qualitative data does not survive the silo. And the inverse being, if you have quant data, it's easy to ship to other places in the organization and people just believe it. They're like, oh, well, 47% of the people said this, therefore it must be true. But if you try to tell a qual story, for some reason, it just doesn't resonate. Like CEOs, CFOs, like they want the real data. So I just think there's some culture, shifts that have to happen with this, but technology is going to create some opportunities for qual data that we've never seen before.
I also have happened to run into product managers that use a lot of inputs and a lot of data to avoid making decisions, and more specifically to avoid making a bad decision.
Yes.
But it's like, oh, the data is telling us to do this. And even from an engineering perspective, this is not just product managers. Like, hey, when you're building an API, you're talking about rate limits and stuff like that. You want to have the data, right? Instead of saying, hey, I happen to run into an API that it is used for reporting, but guess what? People are not using it for reporting every 6 hours, right? They're basically batch downloading all the data at 4 a.m. and you get your spikes, and it's really hard to that has to be a change in the product, right? So, but it's a reaction that you get through support.
Exactly.
And then when you present the data, it's like, what do you mean we have to scale our servers at 4 a.m.? I'm like, well, that's where the traffic is, right?
Exactly.
So we either do an autoscaler that it is delayed, or we do it really fast. But I also have seen that, and this is something that I see all the time. The data that we have at my company, I don't talk a lot about it, but it is first-party data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a lot cleaner.
Yeah, 100%.
Every time you get into third-party data realm, and this is like trying to buy stuff from aggregators and stuff like that, it's just as bad as not asking customers and not capturing any data, right? It's the wild guess, it's less than 40%, blah, blah, blah. The fact that I have a job that allows me to build solutions with data is because the quality of that data happens to be very good. And we're conscious about privacy, and we're doing a bunch of stuff, right? Like, we're not being wasteful even on resources. We're trying to, at the end of the day, part of the business generates ads. And there's this whole notion of the best ad is the one that you really want to see without us knowing who you are.
Exactly.
Right? So that combination has been something that really delivers the value, and we see it on every single solution that we put out there. Customers come to us because, hey, you measure the stuff that I really care. You're not aggregating some other data. You're not you don't have an SDK that you embed into another application, right? It's just our own and operated markets, as well as figuring out clean rooms, right? Like, how do we expose this data in a way that we don't lose control of it because you trust us with that data? So
I think something you brought up is really interesting, because I think where quant data is really powerful, and where I think it would be terrible to use qualitative data, is this example of usage spikes. Like, we don't want to ask customers when they're using the app. We just want to look at when they're using the app. So we're going to build again, we're going to put a scaler in for a certain time, or we're going to make deployment decisions. We're going to make resourcing decisions and things like that. So I think there absolutely is a place for quant data where you don't really care what the customer's telling you. So I think it's about because there's certain types of behaviors that are predictable, and you can predict them through quantitative data. But then there's things like, why are they doing things? Like, we don't know why they're using it at 4 a.m., but we know they're using it at 4 a.m. So let's set up the infrastructure so that we can support 4 a.m. usage. But we may want to know why too, right? So I think, again, it's just understanding those two use cases.
Knowing what they know about this particular use case, I think the why is because that's what they have done in the past.
Sure.
Right? That doesn't mean that there is a better way. That doesn't mean that we cannot set up a clean room where we share that data, and not on an API that it is very expensive for them to ingest, for us to to serve. Like there are other ways to do it, but you don't get that unless you ask like, hey, what's going on here? Like there are patterns about like, hey, we do impersonation of users. So, or we have a system user that pulls everything. Like why do you choose one versus the other one? You don't get that. You just get the spikes and like, hey, there is like 500s going on at 4 a.m. She's like 1 a.m. here. Everything is East Coast time. That's not fun. Okay, so collection is hard on the kind of data that you're capturing, right? Yeah. I would argue that on our side is the amount of data that it is hard. Absolutely. Like, how do you distill that data? Like you probably don't have as much, but we always have trouble. There's a ton of aggregation tools, but it's really easy to make a mistake. So what happens in your world? What's your solution?
Yeah, well, so with the qualitative, it definitely, like, this is probably the biggest problem with qualitative data. It's relatively easy to collect. I mean, once you get someone in an interview and we're talking and someone's taking notes, or we have auto transcription because we're using Gong or Zoom or whatever, we still have piles and piles of data. And I think this is the game changer of generative AI. Like this is what people, honestly, when I talk to B2B product managers, this was the problem they were really interested in solving, which is like, I've got tons of data that I haven't had time to collate. I haven't had time to review. I haven't had time to synthesize and analyze. And a lot of them were using ChatGPT. They were copy pasting, putting stuff in and doing stuff like that. So I think generative AI is the tool that will accelerate this. It's still an 80-90% solution. It's not a 100% solution. We see this with our tool. We see insights being generated, but we have some features that allow you to go a little bit deeper and find different things. We're all figuring this out, but the challenge with LLMs is it's basically conventional wisdom. So it's going to go through your stuff. It may find some interesting things, but it really is based on the large language model's idea of what's interesting, not necessarily what you think is interesting. So you have to inject some context. But short answer, AI is the game changer here because we can process, a 5-7 minute interview in like 30 seconds. And for a human to do that, it's longer than 30 seconds. And it's a lot longer than 30. I was talking to a potential customer of ours, and they have 4 questions. They have 200 people that answered 4 questions, and it's taken them weeks to go through that stuff. And bias starts to creep in. If you're in support, it's always the product's fault. I can tell you that's true as a support person.
We need to have a product person next.
Exactly. It's always the product's fault when unhappy customers. But anyway, I mean, I will say like bias exists. And, I think, as a support person, I am so guilty of just being so pessimistic of the product. And like anytime anything positive comes in, I'm pretty dismissive of it. And I think this is another opportunity where the AI will, hey, here's all the good stuff that's going on, and here's all the bad stuff that's going on. Because if I did the synthesis, it'd be a big pile of bad stuff. And then I'd be like, there's really not that much good stuff happening with our product. So I think those are the opportunities with AI.
Okay, 2 things. I'm pretty sure, like if you go to Amazon and you check any product, they now do a synthesis or like a condensation of all the reviews. I have seen some that are hilarious. That it says, hey, some customers like it because it's pretty, because I don't know, it's red, and some customers dislike it because it's red. And then some customer says that it's I don't know, whatever you're buying it grows larger in the size, or it's smaller. Like it's so confusing. There's still so much going on. But the other thing that I want to mention is you mentioned leadership is skeptical about it. And the way that I think about this is because we have had data for so long, we're just fixated on it.
Yes.
But for example, we have dogs that can smell a disease or drugs or a bunch of stuff that we don't understand. We kind of know that their nose is a lot more powerful than ours,
but we don't know why.
But it's pretty much a skepticism, right? Like, but we still use it. It's just the maturity of AI as it gets, I feel like it's going to go towards that where we're just going to trust it, and we're not there yet, but this is probably a good time to start making it better. Do you, as you're going through some of this, and you said that it is not perfect, are are you doing like continuous improvement on the LLMs that you're using to try to narrow down some of those paths or
I would love to say yes. We just don't have the time right now to do continuous. I do probably more research on our collection side. So I have some tools to test how good the interviews are. But I think it's fair to say that we have a pretty blue sky ahead of us in terms of opportunities to make our analysis and synthesis better. It's definitely top of mind for us, but we need some customer feedback, because I think the Amazon example is really interesting, because some people may be interested about it being read and other people may be read. And then, other people may be like, who cares? So I think like one man synthesis, one woman synthesis, one person synthesis doesn't mean it's useful for everybody, right? So I think where I see a world is where you tell us what's important, and then we pull those things out, and then we tell you what's important, and then we may present to you some things that you hadn't thought about. But it really needs to be requirements driven. And so again, the Amazon case, like the color may not be important to me for the flashlight, but it may be really important for other people when they're buying a flat. That may be like their top criteria. I don't care if it's like works or not. I just want it red to match something in my room. I think on shoes there, and it's like, for example, I'm 5'10", right? Like, what is like the people that are like, or I'm 10 on shoes, I'm 5'10", whatever, I weigh this much. Like, out of all the reviews that you have, create a synthesis based on what kind of like correlates with me more than, because there can be some other person that it is 5'10" and it's totally different game, right? 100%. Because of other things like weight and race and whatever, right? So that's very interesting. You also mentioned AI is the game changer here. You're building a solution that it is powered by AI and a bunch of things. How do you use AI? Like, do you use ChatGPT in your regular work? Like how much are you using AI also to feed your product, going back to you? Yeah, we're using it a fair amount. I mean, I think, like we're doing some product marketing ideas, and I definitely bounce ideas through there. They're often terrible. In fact, they're usually pretty bad. I'll have it like, hey, what's a metaphor for this? Or give me what's a good 2-word combination that describes X? And a lot of times they're pretty bad, but they still kind of get the juices flowing. And I think that's definitely where I use it. I'll use it to edit documents. So like we're applying to different, accelerators, or doing different things. And I'll absolutely like throw in something, have it edit it, take that, and then rework it into my voice or something like that. So it's definitely becoming more and more part of my workflow.
I feel like when I use it, especially around code, I know when it's not right, but it also, seeing what's not right is like watching over somebody else's coding, right? Like you're like, oh no, you're making that mistake, right? Like, which is annoying. You're sharing your screen, it's all awkward. But if you have a machine doing that, it's actually not that bad, because now I look at the code that it spilled out and I'm like, yeah, you kind of like have the idea, but you're missing this. It just makes me think in a different way as a reviewer, or whatever you want to call it.
It's funny. I can't believe I totally forgot that use case, but I think I've more or less given up like programming from scratch. So, I mean, I do a fair amount of Python programming. I have no idea what Rick does because it's all JavaScript.
Nobody knows.
Yeah. I'm not definitely a production coder, but I do write a lot of scripts to do things at the command line, processing documents, integrating information. I have more or less given up writing from scratch, and I give it. And I probably spend as much time using ChatGPT to write code as I probably would just if I wrote it myself. But I do feel like I'm faster with it. And some things just come out, like they come out perfect every time. A great example is like if I'm writing a command line program and, I was using sys to bring in the command line arguments. I'm like, I'm going to bring in an argparse library. This is Python. If you don't speak Python, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But, there's a good library for parsing command line arguments that's way more powerful than just using your standard things that are available in Bash or ZSH or whatever. And so I'll just say it, hey, change all the arguments to use argparse, and boom, it just does it. And it doesn't it just takes out so much busy work. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Commenting code too. It's great for commenting code. Like, comment my code, please. And boop, it's a pretty good solution because it knows what it's doing. it knows what the code's doing.
Yeah. No, I agree. I am not a Python developer, but I was working in Python for the last 6 months, and I knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know the syntax, and it was perfect. It was like, okay, I get it, and it was 80% right, not 100%, but that was just enough. Like I had the basis of what I wanted to do. So it's there. It's just, I don't know. It's like a different mode, as you said. It's probably the same time that you're spending, but you are not like frustrated by, am I missing a library?
Yeah, exactly.
That will make my life easier. Usually they will give it for you.
And again, I'm not doing anything super crazy. I'm doing pretty simple scripts that are processing data, using again, I think Python's probably the ideal language because there's so much information about Python in the LLM. I did a test with some bizarre firmware language that a buddy of mine uses because he does some pretty hardcore hardware firmware stuff. And I couldn't read anything. I had no idea that it speeds, but he laughed at it. He's like, yeah, this isn't really that good. But there's zero references to it online. Like it's a super esoteric language. It had no chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have also seen some of that with Swift UI, right? Like fairly new. And yes, and it's changing. Every release is changing. So whatever code is getting out of it, it's probably not going to work on the latest version. So
I will say I did. Rick wrote the first version of his API, and I dropped all his API docs in there, which there wasn't much. It was pretty thin. That's not a knock. It's moving fast. And I basically said, hey, write a program that uses his API to do what I needed to do, which was to conduct an interview. And it was about an 80-90% solution. Like it got really close using the API documents that I had no idea about. I just injected that as context. So that was pretty cool. And I was off to the races after that.
Yeah, I was doing the same. I was migrating an old MySQL database into Supabase, Postgres, episode of the Common, and whatnot. And it just helped me a lot on MySQL.
On the SQL.
Rusty.
Exactly.
Like you have no, like there are ways to do the stuff that I was doing way faster. Exactly. And it was just, it was very helpful.
SQL's well documented. And it's not like, I've asked it to do things in SQL that is like, that's a terrible idea, Kincy. Don't do this in SQL. use like pandas or some other, because I was trying to pivot, and it's like SQL is really not good at pivoting, but try this, and it didn't work. So I was like, okay, it's right. I got to do something different. So but SQL is really basic and simple, so it's really good at SQL, I think.
Well, it's one of those that I was amazed by it. The other one was this. It's an old system. It happens to use a lot of XML.
Yeah.
And just reading XML attributes and nodes and stuff like that was my nightmare. And now it's like, oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, give me the spec. And like, it just makes some of those things easier.
Turn this into JSON so I can read it.
Yeah. So, okay, good. Anything else you want to add from AI is changing the game? Anything else that you're seeing that kind of like justifies what you're doing before we move into my favorite section, which is building products?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered a lot of it. I mean, it's still new. And I read a really interesting article this morning. I need to go back and close read it, but it's kind of about some of the limitations of LLM. There was this big debate against these two. One guy said, I'm an actual intelligence researcher versus the AI. And it was kind of a heated argument. But I think there are some limitations to AI that we don't fully appreciate. But one thing I'll say about us using it is that we don't have a hallucination problem because we don't create information, because our system is either taking information and then summarizing it, synthesizing and analyzing it, or it's asking questions. And so even if it asks a weird question, that's not a bad thing. That's not the end of the world. I don't create information. Like we don't have the War of 1812 being fought in 1940 and some of the weird, bizarre things that I've seen come out of like hallucinations. So I think that's a huge advantage for us, is that we're kind of turning the generative LLM idea kind of on its side and using it to generate questions instead of generating information, which I think is a real different use case, which plays well to its strengths.
Yeah. A lot of hallucinations are when people take the output as a fact. right?
Yes.
And that's when
and we're
when it
asking
doesn't make
questions,
sense.
so
right?
there's no facts. Like we're not presenting facts, you know.
Okay. Great. That's a great take. There's going to be a lot more heated conversations, I'm sure, as it matures. And the whole concept of RAG has been something that we have talked in several episodes before, which is like they're trained until a certain point of time, and then your RAG is actually allowing it to look at the extra data, and that's when curation and continuous improvement really works. I want to come back into building products. We talk about like qual versus quant data, and I think we agree that it is not one or the other one. So give me some use cases, or when do you think one is useful versus the other one?
I think when you're building new features and you want to understand user behavior, I think why. So I think why they want something is really important. I think whenever you need to know why, like you got to ask people, you got to talk to them, because data rarely is going to show you why. And so I think that's a really important use case. Again, knowing when or how things are happening, that's probably a better use case for quant. Kind of Sarah and a star, as I'm thinking about it. But I think, we won't go down that language rabbit hole. But I think there's a lot of culture things too. I think different companies value different things. Like I talked to a product manager at Apple, and they definitely appreciate qualitative data. Like she said, it's all about the story. It's about telling a story. You want to back it up with data. You can't just show up and say, hey, I talked to this guy and I think we should do this. But they'll listen to that and they want to anchor it in some sort of data, but they don't need like, databases full of, data lakes full of like data to prove that this is right or wrong. Because what I found is like my experience is when people use the word data driven, what they're really saying is, I'm going to cherry pick data to support my decision.
Your hypothesis is already your mind is already made up, and you're just using data to justify it.
Exactly.
And sometimes that's good. There are frameworks like A/B testing, right? Like for what we call experimentation. The typical use case is the color of the buttons that you mentioned. Like this is green, this is purple. Which one do you click? And that is very, I would say, very quantitative analysis, right? Like absolutely. It's just percentages. Do you see A/B testing frameworks going towards more qualitative things? Like, for example, in the case of your interviews on OneStudy, like when you get an interview, can you create multiple versions of that interview? Like, how do you, have you thought about it? Is that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, I think, I need to think about that a little bit more. That's a really interesting idea about kind of A/B testing these interviews, because I think it's a good use case for that, as long as you have enough data to like, as long as you're going to like do enough interviews. I mean, I've done a lot of interviews. I think I've A/B tested. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think I've done some A/B testing unknowingly.
Yeah, of course. You're always iterating as you go.
Exactly.
It's just, do you make it part of your framework? Because you always disregard A/B testing, or not always, but always put it in the quantitative analysis, right? And very much focus on UI interfaces, like web interfaces, right? But it's really everywhere. It goes with training models, with your training data set versus like all of that is in there, because I think it's broader than that. I was just curious, like, hey, this could be something that you could take.
No, that's a really interesting idea. I want to think about that a little bit, like how, because I think, I keep saying this. I need to think about this before I have a strong opinion on this.
You will be back.
I'm definitely like kind of mulling this over. Like, I think this is a really interesting way to, and again, I think there's an opportunity here if you can qualitatively interview people at scale. Like this gets really interesting, because again, if I can only afford to like interview 20 or 30 people, I don't know if it's worth like splitting those into half and doing A or a B. But if I could do like 1,000 people like really quickly, that gets really interesting. Now that's cool. I like this idea.
Okay, I have another idea for you.
Okay.
This is something that I talked to Rick about when we were chatting about like some of the experiments that we were doing on Friction Log. I was like, hey, you should probably do, when you either quit or you get fired and you get your exit interview, right? Like an exit interview for your products or a new product version of saying like, I don't know, you're Apple and you do kind of like an exit interview for the iPhone 15. What was well, what was not well, powered by AI. That's like the exit interview is the next product that you're going to build for me because I'm going to use it for a bunch of stuff that I do.
Well, we've been doing, so I think, in the success world, and I do hear B2C people talking about this a lot. It's churn, right? It's a churn opportunity. We did run for a customer. We ran a churn interview. So we hit, thousands of customers who had left the app within a month, and we hit them with an interview to understand like why they were churning. So we are doing that today, and it's definitely an important technique, getting that exit interview. And I think the advantage of being upfront about it being an AI interview is that the likelihood of you getting candid feedback is much higher, because the problem with success managers is that they're nice, and like customers don't want to break the success manager's heart. I'm totally guilty of this. Like I don't want to tell my success manager that I'm really not that thrilled about the product, because I like them as a person. And I know if I tell them, hey, success manager, this product's really not working for me, I'm probably going to go, like, it just sets off all kinds of problems for them. Like, they're going to have to do customer reviews and red and green and yellow and amber, like reports and all this other stuff. So, you're just like, yeah, the product's great. And then you churn, But if I could tell somebody where I knew it was going to go into a place where that person wasn't going to be judged, where I could be really honest and say, I love my success manager, but the product was terrible, or my onboarding was awful, or I just don't need it anymore. I think that's the opportunity here.
I think so, because you talk about churn. I mentioned like somebody quit or was fired and you do an exit interview. We in software development have basically postmortems when incidents happen, right?
Yep.
But when you deprecate the system, when you have a new version, when you have a new API version, I don't think people really, everybody's just so happy to turn it off that nobody actually analyzes what went well. There was a reason why you replaced it, but like, it was an exit interview for a given product or capability of like, hey, here's where we screw up, because if you don't analyze that, you're probably going to make the same mistake again.
But you bring up a really interesting point, because I think the problem with postmortems, and again, I'm guilty of this as a support leader, as a professional services leader, as a leader, is that the bias is typically toward the negative, right? Because we want to fix things. Like typically we want to solve problems, and solving problems as opposed to like reinforcing positive behaviors. I think one of the things I'm thinking about from a modeling perspective about how we summarize these interviews is maybe we have two summaries. Maybe we have like a positive summary and a negative summary. So I could imagine like a postmortem where, we're evaluating the data that we're evaluating the qualitative data that comes out of a postmortem, and we pull out the positive stuff, because I guarantee you, if you talk to people after a postmortem, the only thing they remember is what went really wrong, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They don't remember all the things that went well.
Like in a retrospective on an agile sprint cycle, right? Like talking to people, you usually start what went well, right? And there are like 5 things, and you can tell that those 5 things are not really, they're a given, right? Like you will be a very dysfunctional organization.
I had a keyboard on my computer. That went really well.
My battery on my Bluetooth keyboard stayed on.
Exactly.
Whatever, right? And when it's the bad stuff, there is a ton of stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then everybody's depressed. And then you have that people, because these are people that you work with every single day. And therefore, you feel bad, like, because whatever, like, I don't know, I'm going to complain an API, like, hey, somebody changed the contract, which broke everything.
Exactly.
Right? That somebody actually has a first name and a last name, and it's in that call. So 100%. I cannot say that. So I'm like, well, we should, and then we twist our own words into something that is not actionable, right? Like, well, we should probably have an API lifecycle strategy.
Yeah.
oh, cool, somebody's gonna write that down, and nobody's gonna care.
No one's, yeah, exactly.
So it's that machine interaction. I do think that it gives you that freedom to be open.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it'd be cool if you. I mean, again, that's a use case we've talked about is doing post-incident research using AI, because again, you can do it quickly. So you could do it like within hours, minutes, days of an incident, as opposed to scheduling everyone, giving everyone together. Like if you could collect all that data right away and then summarize it, synthesize it, and then talk about it a couple weeks later, that's a really interesting opportunity for sure.
So anyhow, more ideas over there. I don't have any data to back it up, but I have a good nose, I guess, like a good like dog. All right. So all of this is it's coming to one, like where we're talking about like the different types of analysis that you do. It comes back that Steve Jobs quote where he was quoting also Ford about like the faster horse, and everybody can Google that. Like I'm not going to read it entirely, but it basically says customers don't know what they want. It's our job to predict and to do it. But that's cool if you have a $1 billion company or a $1 trillion company and you have the time to spend a ton of money on research and a bunch of stuff. And yes, they have deadlines and stuff like that. You're a small company. You're a B2C, you're a B2B that is just starting out. And I feel like we want to follow those steps. But you have talked to a lot of product people and a lot of businesses. Do you see that as well? Is that like the legacy of that Steve Jobs quote that we're seeing?
I didn't hear a lot of people say that. I would say most of the people were fairly tuned to what their customers want. But this is how I think about that quote is Steve Jobs can get away with that quote, not because he's $1 billion company, because he probably said that when Apple was like about to die for like the third time or something, like who knows. But the point is like he's building consumer products that were going to really create new experiences. But you know, the overwhelming majority of us are working to solve real problems that people have. Like the iPhone didn't really solve a problem at the end of the day. And then again, that's like the classic product that everyone talks about when they talk about that quote. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that Ford was probably solving a pretty real problem just in a novel way with, you know, an internal combustion engine instead of something being pulled by mammals. But I think most of us are like, we're solving problems. And so when you're solving problems, you got to listen to the people who have the problems. I mean, I think it's that simple. But if you're trying to create something really new and novel, that's cool too. You probably don't want to listen to customers because they have no idea about this new novel thing that you're creating. I don't think it's resources. I think it's just what your product goal is. And I think a lot of people confuse what they're doing as some sort of like vision of the future, and they're not really finding out what the problems that they're actually trying to solve. Again, I would argue, I'm not sure what problem the iPhone solved. It's created a lot of problems, but it definitely has created like an amazing platform for innovation and stuff like that. But like no one at any point was like, gosh, you know, if only I had a phone that could do X, Y, and Z. Like there were parts of it. He just kind of put all that together. I think that's the genius there. But not a lot of us have that opportunity to do something like that. And there's a ton of failures. Like it's easy to think like, oh yeah, but most people who are building like cars instead of faster horses fail.
Yes, there is the AI pin that was announced like a few months back. I think it's gone. Like it was just totally wrong and like.
But you know, but we need those ideas, right? I mean, to me,
of course.
Cool, man. That's a cool. Maybe it's not a good idea, but at least they tried.
Yeah.
But no one's going to remember that 5 years from now. You know, but we all remember Steve Jobs for the iPhone. But man, there's a ton of like iPhone-esque failures.
Oh, even within Apple and Newton back in the day, right?
Exactly.
Like,
exactly.
So it was there, and it created problems, you said, but also when it matured, it created new opportunities, like I don't know, rideshare, for example, right? Uber, Lyft, things like that, right?
Tons of
new
markets. I mean, can't even imagine life without mobile devices. It'd be ridiculous. Like, it absolutely created way more opportunities and problems. But again, I think there's very far and few between these game changers. And there's been a lot of game changers that or attempts to change the game that like failed miserably. No one celebrates those. You know, no one celebrates all those like those graveyards of like products that never worked. But there's a lot of mediocre products that survive because they solve real problems that people are having today.
And they were products that solve problems, and still Google killed them because they do have a pretty big cemetery of good products. Google Reader, I still miss it. Okay.
For sure.
When you mentioned churn, and I want to finish on this quote, right? Like when you mention churn, you mention like talking to clients, B2C and stuff like that. It feels like every single B2C product, it's a very transactional relationship, right? There is no loyalty between companies. Like it's really hard to create that Apple loyalty or that IKEA loyalty or like all of those things. Like, I don't know, like I was thinking, I was buying a camera, right? Like a GoPro versus an Insta360 camera.
Mm-hmm.
I had a GoPro before, but I have no loyalty to it. Like in this world of transactional relationship between customers and company, and then all the social media stuff. So, how much value do you think there is in spending time with your clients?
Well, I think that's the only way you can build something that solves problems. And I think, I don't know, I think the idea that we live in a purely transactional world is a little overblown. I mean, I think Apple's like the greatest example of this. Like it's a very high price luxury item, but I think I love Apple. I love their products, but if it stopped working as well as it did for my use case, I would probably start looking for alternatives. But so far they've been able to maintain a pretty high bar of quality that's kept me loyal. And I think that's the key. And I think to understand what your customers want and to consistently deliver it, clearly people will pay premium prices for stuff if it works and it delivers value. So I think that the only way you can really understand, because what changes are customer preferences. So I think Apple's done a reasonably good job of kind of like moving with their customers and not moving too far ahead of them. Like I think they're introducing AI at the right time. I think that's a great example. They could have probably dropped in a ton of AI on this last phone, but it probably would have been a terrible experience.
And it was there. They just never call it out as AI, right?
Yeah,
There's a ton of stuff going on photos and face recognition and
but
blah,
exactly.
Blah, blah. But
it's
never
subtle. It's just like, oh, this is cool. And you could ignore it if you want. Like you don't have to, it doesn't hit you in the face. Like use this to generate magical castles with unicorns that, and erase people from pictures. Like, I'm not sure if that's a great use case, like there's probably some people that want to do this and it's like easy to see. But again, like, I just feel like they kind of stay with their customers. They don't get too far ahead of them, but they don't get too far behind them either. But they're clearly listening and they're understanding like what the actual world use cases are. But I think there's a lot of brands that have a lot of loyalty. But again, as long as they deliver value, right? I mean, that's the key. Man.
That's the key.
You got to be able to solve your problems.
Yeah, we could take a whole hour just talking about what's a picture and how much do you edit it before it's no longer a picture. It's more like a Photoshop image. And I have thoughts about it, and sometimes they are very strong. Sometimes I'm like, well, actually, like I know before digital pictures, there was still editing going on, and you can remove stuff. And like I read a lot of it, and it was like, what makes a picture and a picture, right?
Exactly. And what makes it a fact, right? Like,
and what makes it a good memory? Because it's usually not the perfect picture, the ones that brings back the good memories.
Yes,
so
100%.
It's something very abstract that I know you can geek out with me for a long time on this.
I've been talking to a lot of people about this because I mean, there was that quote by the guy at Samsung, like phones haven't taken pictures, real pictures, like they're all imaginary in the past like 10, 15 years. Again, the moment you have like 3 cameras taking the same, we could rabbit hole on this next time.
But well, first of all, I want to thank you. It's a lot of your time. It's probably more than we expected, but it's definitely, this is very good. I really like our conversation. 2 different perspectives. Everything around building a product, and I want to give you some time to plug in and send people to OneStudy, to you, to talk to you. So you can promote yourself in the next few minutes.
I think Rick and I are both terrible self-promoters, but so I'm just going to say go to OneStudy, ONE study.ai, and see what we're doing. We're about to launch a new marketing website. That will be coming out. That will coincide with Rick's. He's pitching us at a contest down in Fort Lauderdale in a couple days. So we definitely even just tell us what you think about our website. Like we've been very candid. We've struggled a little bit with getting the messaging right because we're doing something that's kind of obvious, but people are struggling to understand. And so we're really trying to get that right. But anyway, OneStudy.ai, check us out, get a demo, get a pilot, try us out. We'll show you what's up. We'll get you a lot of qualitative feedback.
Kincy, thank you very much again. Man. Thank you, everybody that it is watching or listening. I believe we have made it very clear for you that you can listen to this and you don't have to watch it, but we're available on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcast. So until the next one, I hope to have you back soon.
Definitely. Thanks, Cesar. Bye, guys. Thank you.